the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, Episode 9.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Ray. On today's episode, we have David McLelland, who operates Auracle Geospatial Inc., a remote sensing and geospatial technology company based out of Vancouver Island, Canada. David is truly a leading expert in the field of remote sensing and has been a trusted colleague of mine for years now. We've worked together on various projects and proposals, not only in the U.S., but also in Africa and Mexico, and David has worked literally around the world. Before we get into the interview, I'd like to remind you of my upcoming trip to South Africa, where I'll be speaking at the SARWA Conference and Educational Workshop Seminar on March 8th. And some of the technology we discussed today, I will actually be showcasing in that presentation. Also, I'll link to my article in the RWA magazine on finding a job during an industry downturn. Would love to hear your feedback on that article. You can email me at globalenergyleaders@gmail.com. Finally, a reminder for our book giveaway. Last week we had on Dr. Andrew Inkpen from Arizona State, and if you would like to be entered to win a copy of his book, all you have to do is leave a written review in iTunes. Not much, just a little written review in iTunes, and you will be entered to win this. If you've already left a review, you're already entered, and thank you for that. As I mentioned, our guest today is David McLelland, and I had a blast doing this. And so you can find David's full bio and everything we talk about in the show notes. Without further ado, here's my conversation with David. David, hadn't talked to you in a long time. It's good to hear from you today, and thank you for coming on the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Yeah, it's a wonderful time of the year for us, and I'm doing very well. How about you?
Well, I was about to say, we were talking before we got online here, and it's like 75 degrees down here in Texas. And what was the temperature up there in Vancouver?
It's around 0 Celsius, so about 30.
30 degrees, and so yeah, it's kind of an odd time for us, as it should be a little bit cooler than 70, but 70 is a nice temperature, so we're not complaining too much. So let's kind of get into it just at a 30,000 foot level. Kind of explain for the audience, what is remote sensing? It's kind of this new thing that you're hearing a lot about, but what is it, and what do you do as a remote sensing scientist, and what does that field encompass?
Okay, well, thanks for that. Yeah, there's a lot of misunderstanding around remote sensing, but remote sensing is simply using sensors to measure things from a distance, to be able to measure maybe the heat emission, or there are two kinds. There's passive remote sensing and active remote sensing. One of them is a type of remote sensing that sends down some kind of a signal or some kind of energy and then collects it back up and measures the difference. The other one is a type that measures passive energy, the energy that's emitted from the Earth or from an object, using various different kinds of sensors and computers to model the results. So it's pretty basic.
Okay, and so what are some of the applications that remote sensing scientists, or remote sensing, or active and passive remote sensing, as you described, would we see in the energy sector? How would that apply to the energy sector, whether it be oil and gas or coal or renewables? What are some of the applications that people may go, okay, I didn't know that you could use remote sensing to accomplish that task?
Sure. Well, remote sensing being used right from the discovery phase all the way through production to transmission in the energy sector. It's used to find the resources to begin with, and it's used to locate the general areas that resources might be in. As we develop globally as a population, we know that things are going to be deeper and more buried and more dilute than they have in the past. And as a result, remote sensing has a growing role in trying to find the resources that we all need. And it does that in a number of different ways. Of course, there is airborne remote sensing and airborne geophysics. using magnetics and gravity. There's also spectral data that tells us about the nature of the rock or the nature of the earth around us or vegetation. And those things can all be affected by the presence of certain elements or certain minerals, and of course also by hydrocarbons. And so they leave something called proxy signatures, little tells that tell us where there is a high likelihood or probability of finding something. And when you combine them all together, you get an understanding of the Earth's structure, the composition, and some of the effects. And those things all become little bits of evidence that you can put together like a detective to say, this is a high likelihood or a high probability of being a prospect. And then from there, of course, remote sensing is being used to model the areas that are being developed so that we have a better understanding of the position of the information that we have, and it can be more robust. And in that way, people can rely on it. Now, when you're spending the kind of money that the energy sector has to spend to develop new prospects, it's critically important that they don't make spatial errors. And again, remote sensing comes in to guide the general location of work.
So I want to circle back there for 1 second. You mentioned spectral, and the first time I ever heard of multi and hyperspectral imaging and all this stuff was when we talked to you, 2 or 3 years ago. We first kind of met, started talking. Could you kind of break down what that is, and then how that applies to these fragments that you're saying that you find?
Sure. So the light that is reflected back off of the Earth by the sun from the sunlight that it receives can be collected by a variety of different types of sensors that are kind of like cameras, not entirely unlike the cameras that we use, except that they're a lot more complex in their design because they will collect the thermal emissions of the Earth as well as the reflectance of the various different spectra from the sunlight. And that spectra represents the things that the sun has been reflected off of, whether it's rock, soil, or plants. And as we get better at doing it, we're able to refine the division between the different wavelengths more and more. And because of that, we're able to create signatures, just like you would with a voice recording. Signatures of certain types of light that tell us whether or not we're looking at a granite or we're looking at a hydrocarbon. And those signatures can be compiled and classified to tell us what it is that we're looking at on the Earth. Vegetation is an emerging important component of the whole exploration and monitoring phase, because vegetation uptakes the things that are underneath it, and as a result, it changes the reflectance of the vegetation. So we know that certain plants are affected by certain materials, and we also know that certain plants just don't exist in the absence of some materials. That's a big formula, and we're just starting to put those pieces together. But we do have some pretty standard or standardized sources for information. In other words, there are certain things that don't belong in certain places, and when they're there in the vegetation world, we know that there's either been contamination or a natural seep.
Could you just break down what do we see in, if we're looking through our eyes, and then these bands or wavelengths, how many are there that you're using for these sensors?
Sure. Well, it really depends on the sensor that we use. And so when we look at something with our eyes, we're looking at something called the visible spectrum. And part of that includes something called the visible infrared or visible near infrared. And then beyond that is something called the shortwave infrared spectrum. The shortwave infrared spectrum is the part of light that we don't see. But it's critically important to being able to differentiate materials, certain types of materials. In fact, what we're really doing is measuring the absorption features of the materials. And because of that, just like people do when they're in a lab and they're measuring the types of material using a spectrometer, we're able to use a reflectance spectrometer to measure what is on the surface of the Earth. There are other frequencies that we also use. We do a lot of work in radar, which is active remote sensing, and it emits various different frequencies of microwaves, just like our cell phones receive and send. And those microwaves give us other types of signatures because they penetrate objects and they go through vegetation at certain frequencies. They go through dirt and overburden at certain frequencies. And so we're able to look at the texture, fabric, and structure of the rock beneath our feet, sometimes tens of meters, if not hundreds of meters below our feet. In fact, recently, of course, the public has seen discoveries of sub-Saharan lakes and sub-Saharan archaeology that was discovered using radar. That's satellite microwave radar. The spectral data, to get back to it, is divided into three basic groups. Aside from the wavelength, we've got multispectral radar, superspectral radar, and hyperspectral radar, hyperspectral light. And the difference is hyper really just means overlapping. It's something that has been measured using hyperspectral signatures is something that has overlapping wavelengths or frequencies that gives us a more continuous version of the spectra of a single area that we're looking at. Multispectral means that those things are all divided out into little parcels that we look at, and we classify them based on the relationship of those parcels of light. And as we improve our ability to put up satellites, or not just to put them up, but to build satellites, we also are improving the data that we get and our ability to model that. And I think it's important to bear in mind that a whole lot of this is a result of vast improvements in computer processing, because all of that data has to actually be compiled up in space very energy efficiently and then transmitted down to the Earth. And then finally, it has to be pulled apart and restructured. And that all takes a huge amount of computer processing. When I started all of this, a process that we normally do here would take about 18 hours on a Cray supercomputer. And the same process on one of our massive graphics processing unit computers takes about 5 minutes, 6 minutes.
Wow, that's impressive. Real quick, I want to ask you this because you brought up the satellites, and I'm not nearly as in this as you are. So one of the problems we've had historically when we're buying imagery or working with you guys on a project is the cost of the acquisition of the satellite data. But if I'm correct, 2017 or 2018, there's going to be a lot more birds in the sky that's going to reduce that cost. Is that still what they're projecting, or has that changed?
No, that hasn't changed. They're still on target, and the fact is that satellite access to data will increase dramatically over the next few years. for a couple of reasons. One isn't just the number of birds in the sky. It also has to do with the number of ground stations that can download the data that those satellites are producing.
Oh, okay.
And every month there's an increase in those downlinks. Now, they're always producing data or always have the capacity to produce data, but they don't always pass by a downloading station that they can offload all the data onto. And the more downlinks there are, the more data can be had. And they're increasing quite a bit. Of course, the number of satellites is increasing, and the efficiency and veracity of the data is increasing dramatically. So, when you look down at the Earth from a satellite, for a start, you're moving at 15,000 kilometers an hour, and you're looking down at a point in space, and you're looking through an atmosphere, which is like looking through a very long lens. And that atmosphere contains water and other particulates, and the science behind making it so that we can look from that great distance down to the Earth's surface and see things is like standing on top of a mountain in Colorado with a long telephoto lens and taking a picture of your friend in Nevada.
Yeah, not something we want to try, I don't think, anytime soon.
No. But it's a marvelous science.
Oh, it's fascinating and truly above my education level, which that's not saying much, but it's for experts like yourself who understand all of this impressive technology. I want to transition a little bit to your 3D bare rock model. Could you kind of break down, what was the idea to develop this, and what is it, and how is it being used in the marketplace?
Sure, thanks for that. We've been working on the 3D bare rock model for 14 years. And it started out simply because access to radar data and the ability to access information on the ground through radar data seemed to be an opportunity that wasn't being exploited. Now, radar has some features that other data don't have, and one of them is that it has the ability to penetrate weather. So radar is unaffected by the weather. The type of radar that we use is not affected by weather. And in the climates that we live in and that we work in, weather becomes a really important issue. Seasonal effect and weather can affect optical data. And so we started working with radar, and over time, we developed it to the degree that we built something called a stereo radar set to try to eliminate some of the noise that's inherent in radar. And when we did that, we were able to exploit a whole lot more of the signal that was inherent in the data itself. As a result, we started seeing that it was able to penetrate more of the Earth than had previously been imagined. So we built this stereoscopic radar model, and we soon realized that the modeling of the data was not right because it was being modeled by the surface that it wasn't seeing. The radar doesn't see like we see. It isn't seeing the same things. And all along, we've been trying to condition that radar to see what we see, to make it line up with geographic features. Well, the features it's detecting are not the same as the ones that we see. So we had to develop a way of modeling a surface that was the surface that the radar was seeing, and we did accomplish that. And we did it by fusing very high-resolution optical data, at the time WorldView 2 stereo optical data, with stereo radar data, and creating a new type of model. When we did that, we had this fusion of optical and radar that we were able to use to try to better see the world around us, and it resulted in what we call the 3D bare rock model, and it's called that because it goes down to the first competent reflector. In other words, it penetrates most things and goes down to the first reflector. I should also add that radar doesn't see snow or ice, and since we are based in the north, optical data alone would never satisfy our needs. But we can collect optical data during optimum times and use radar data from any time and put it together. Now, I don't want to make it sound like it's just any old radar data. We have really specific requirements on the geometry, but the results are pretty spectacular. We've been able to map and model oil targets and mineral targets all over the planet, and map geology that's been previously unseen to improve the geological mapping of the time, and as a result, improve the results of geophysics. Does that help?
No, yeah, that's extremely helpful. And so, where do you see this technology going over the next 5 to 10 years? Like you've been working for 14 years, so how are you going to try to innovate and just kind of work this out as we go forward?
Sure. Thanks. The first natural result for us was to say, look, if we can accurately model the Earth's subsurface, and I should tell you that this also really includes what's at, in, and on the near surface of the Earth. That layer of Earth above the seismic data area that really is quite unknown. There are a couple of things that have come out of it that are pretty obvious. One of them is that we can often find water, which in many industrial applications is critical, and in human terms is critical. We can locate disturbed Earth. We can tell where the Earth has been disturbed. But equally important, if we have a very robust model that includes radar, all we need to do to monitor change on the Earth with that model in 3D is collect another set of radar data. And with that, we can measure movements as small as 2 millimeters over 140 kilometers. Now, that ability has been around for some time, but it has been overshadowed by the distortion, layover, and foreshortening of radar, which has made it very imprecise for surveying purposes and for location. It also hasn't told anybody anything about the quality of the change. With this addition, the monitoring effect that we're able to bring into it, that we call the Auracle system, the Auracle 3D monitoring system, we're able to monitor the Earth within the envelope of something like a pipeline, where geohazards can create damage to infrastructure, knocking out whole sections of line, or whole sections of power lines, or whole sections of roads because of things like landslides. Most of the time, these things are completely unseen, and they can be 5 kilometers or 5 miles away from the actual line itself, and still cause the damage that forms the stress that creates the leak.
Right, right. Well, you know, I got to say this before we go further. I remember last year when you were kind enough to invite me up to the conference in Vancouver there, and just had a blast. But one of the things that came out of the conference was I knew you were a really smart guy, but your peers just raved about how you were on the cutting edge of technology, and it's clear just talking to you again and kind of getting back into all this, just how advanced some of the stuff that you guys are doing are. And so just kudos to you on some of the work you've done. And I want to kind of shift the conversation to where our discussions have been over the last year or two, which is understanding and helping energy companies, especially in the oil and gas sector, how to mitigate risk when it comes to leaks. And you've kind of touched on that a little bit. So first off, I don't know if people really understand This is a multi-billion-dollar issue that pipeline companies have around the world when they look at loss from leaks and theft and all this stuff. And it's something that's not really getting better, but the technology is there. And historically, like we mentioned, it's been really expensive to acquire satellite data. That trend is going to shift over the next year or two. So kind of give us a perspective of the global loss prevention industry and where that's at and where is it going and how are you guys going to play a role in that, because there's no doubt you're going to be a big player in the next 3 to 5 years as those costs come down and your software gets its its name recognition that it deserves.
Well, thanks for your kind words. I want to first mention that I don't do this by myself. I'm part of a team of experts in various different fields that add a whole lot to the soup that we make every day. And I wanted to say that because I think it's really important. We operate a very collaborative type of interdisciplinary science in order to be able to look at things from a very different way. As regards the loss prevention of infrastructure, particularly pipelines, there was a recent leak in Saskatchewan, Canada, along a river, and to date that has cost well over $100 million, and they feel that it'll be at least $200 million before it's all said and done. These types of losses are staggering in their cost, both environmentally and financially. And in many cases, they can be predicted, not particularly in all cases, because of course massive earth events will still occur, and they will occur instantaneously. But many of these things can be detected at distance and over time. So along with the other things that we measure rates of change that can tell people that something is increasing, that there's a higher potential for a rotational event or a slide or a landslide, or that there's undermining occurring at a river interface, or that there's something under the water that's moving against their line. The earth is constantly moving, and we can't stop that. But what we can do is detect when we find inordinate measurement or inordinate change that can affect the infrastructure or assets that people have and the environment around it. And because of the nature of the work that we're doing, because we're using satellites, it can be done without affecting other people. It doesn't require the same social permission to move ahead. It doesn't require permits. It doesn't require any of the other things that can cause problems, and it can be done in any weather. So it can be done very regularly and very accurately. Of course, we've all heard about hot tapping, pipeline theft. It isn't just a hobby industry. These are very technical programs in some cases, and they're under cover of vegetation or under the earth. And those are the types of things that we can detect. We can detect the subtle changes that indicate those things are taking place.
Let me jump in real quick there, because one of the things that you're talking about, and we've talked about this because we've partnered up and tried to go out there and promote some of this stuff in different places. And the problem I always get is from the oil and gas companies is it's too expensive. It's too expensive. And this is a multi-billion-dollar a year deal where you're looking at places like in Mexico where there's a lot of hot taps going on, or as you mentioned in Saskatchewan, there was a leak in North Dakota the other day. And then you get into some of these African nations and there's pipeline theft going on all over the place. Why is it that if this technology is available, that people aren't rushing to your door and going, hey, I need this? Because it seems that we've seen this trend of they're going to roll the dice. Is the market finally adjusting and saying, okay, we need to be a little bit more preventive, and they're going to go after this technology? Or is it kind of an old school mentality where this technology just scares them because it is new and trendy?
Well, I think part of it is that regulation is coming that will mandate that they must monitor pipelines. I can appreciate that most of these transmission companies are businesses, and that monitoring is an extensive cost. It's a cost that is not associated directly with production. And so they look at it as an additional burden on cost. The reality, though, is that it is part of risk management, and it will save them money. And certainly using satellites, as much as they talk about it being expensive, is a disruption. And disruptors are never really all that quickly favored. We're all told that if you build a mousetrap, the world will beat a better path to your door. That isn't particularly the case. People are creatures of habit. They like to do things the same way they've always done them. And so we believe that we have a new technology that is a disruption, but it's a good disruption. It's a disruption that will assist pipeline companies in the one biggest problem that they currently have, and that's the ability to get the license that they need to move forward and to build new lines.
We'll be back with our conversation with David McLelland, but first, let's hear from our sponsor.
For over 20 years, R Squared Global has served the energy and infrastructure industries. With offices in Texas, Alabama, and Louisiana, R Squared Global offers engineering, survey, right-of-way, and GIS solutions. For more information, please visit www.gor2.com.
One of the things that you touched on there, and I want to emphasize again because you did a good job, but just to make sure it's said twice, is you're up in Canada right now, and
yes.
I'm in Texas, and I know I'm gonna kind of make a fake analogy here, but the point with the same is you can monitor the pipelines by me without ever leaving Canada, and you can do it on your computer, you can do it remotely, you don't have to be here. And so what that means is if you're paying someone to go way out in West Texas where there's no real roads to monitor a pipeline, or you're talking about going to Nigeria or wherever you want to go, it can be done from the computer. When we look at some of these areas where there is tension and there is maybe a threat of war breaking out or war is breaking out, this technology gives companies the ability to safely watch their assets while they don't ever have to put boots on the ground unless they need to go and maybe do some protection or some intervention or some repairs. But if there's an area that's hard to access or it's not safe to access, you're saying that you can do that without actually going there and impeding anybody that's in that area, correct?
That's correct. And so we've done work in FARC territory in Colombia, and we've conducted work in Greenland. And the costs of doing any work on the ground in either of those places are extraordinary. Insurances alone for manpower are right off the charts. We know that we can mitigate that cost by doing our work.
Absolutely. And on top of that, you have to find people to go there, or you have to hire locals, and then you get into government regulation on running your business inside their nation and all that stuff. So this solution seems to solve a lot of those type of issues.
It does. So the whole issue around access to data is critically important. We can provide regular access to data, and we can guarantee that we can monitor things. You can't do that in any other way. So aircraft have problems because sometimes the weather won't allow them to fly, and sometimes the political activity in an area makes it dangerous for them to fly. Not only that, it's a moving platform, and it just can't tell you that small amount of change that may be the precursor to a very major event.
Okay,
so,
let me just hop in there because you mentioned planes. I want to play a little bit of devil's advocate for an audience member who may be listening and says, well, we've used planes for years and they worked fine. So let me play devil's advocate here and say, okay, well, we use planes and we've always caught our leaks beforehand. What is the advantage other than, we have to miss a little bit of weather, but here in the States, we're not worried about war breaking out. So we can fly these pipelines. So why would I want to use satellite technology?
Sure. Well, as the air gets busier, as the sky gets busier, companies are now being required in many cases to have special permits to be able to do remote sensing by airplane. And we don't require those permits. And at times, companies have been refused those permits, or those permits have been delayed. And we don't ever run into that. The other part to it is that actually flying a line with a helicopter or a plane is expensive. It's very expensive. And our costs are always fixed. There's no such thing as too much time behind the stick. So there's no time that you're going to be paying double for that helicopter to sit on the ground
Right.
while it waits for weather to clear.
Okay, and so another objection you may see is someone saying, well, it's probably quicker to do it with the plane, to get the data there. You land the plane, you take it, you plug it into the server. Is that true?
Well, it's not been my experience, and we've flown a whole lot of geophysics line kilometers and line miles. You've got to get whatever it is there to begin with, and there can be a multiplicity of different things can cause delays. The fact is that we can simply go on, order the data, and within very short period of time have it in hand and turn it around within 5 hours back to our client.
That's great.
Now, it takes longer than 5 hours to fly a line.
Right. And there's a lot of, and we don't want to get the weeds on this, but there's a lot of cloud stuff that's going on where you can process your algorithms in the cloud, and I don't want to get in the weeds on that because I fully don't understand it, and it's not necessarily relevant, but it is a faster process because of some of the workflows that you can build out with the satellites and the ground stations that you already mentioned, correct?
Well, there are areas on Earth that you simply can't fly. The cloud forest in Colombia, the rainforest of White Russia, they just simply can't be flown except at very unusual times of the year. And so the reality is that these things don't take place typically when ideal conditions exist. They take place when things are in bad conditions, when there are storms and in the winter and when things have frozen and thawed. Those are the critical times, and those are the times that we can always get data. Our collection is unaffected by conditions.
Right. Okay, well, look, David, I want to be courteous of your time.
There's one more thing I wanted to add.
Yeah, go ahead. Anything you want to get off?
And that's this. For anybody that's ever tried to collect satellite data when they needed it, most people get bumped because I think most companies are aware as well that 70% of the satellite data use is government use or military use. But we're an intellectual or information property partner with the satellite suppliers. And that means that we don't get bumped. We get satellite data when we order it because we're part of the company. So our partnerships with Digital Globe and other satellite suppliers make it so that when you order data through us, you get it. And we can schedule it.
And you're right. There's a lot of value to that because we have tried to order it apart from you guys before we met you guys, and it was always kind of a hassle. But partnering up with you guys over the past few years has really kind of changed how we've been able to acquire data and understand. This is a big thing, and that I didn't really know until we started working with you guys a few years ago is, when we go to buy satellite imagery, we can buy a certain type of satellite imagery for, let's just say, X, and then as we did recently on a project with you guys, we bought Y because Y was just a tad bit more expensive, but the data that it carried we can use in a lot of different ways that we previously didn't understand. And so for just a little bit more cost, we got a lot more value that we never would have been able to, understand that was even available to us. And so, yeah, partnering up with a company like yourself is critically important. And so I want to be gracious of your time. I know you're very busy and you got stuff going on today, so thank you so much. Anything that you want to plug or promote or that you have going on that you would like for the audience to know about?
Well, yes, I do. I think that what you just alluded to is really important. Our partnership with you, Ryan, and your group is paramount to us because most of these things require some kind of information for us to be able to execute them properly, and that requires professional knowledge. And so the whole issue about being able to order data, when you do work or you want work done through Oracle and you call Ryan, we do an exhaustive archival search of every bit of data that's available on the planet. We have vast archives, access to the archives of most of the companies. And in many cases, it can save you a lot of money. And I'll just leave you with that.
No, and I wanted to just to follow up on that because we have, unfortunately, we've done a lot more bids together than we have actually done projects. But you guys are always gracious with your time, and you do, like you say, you do extensive research, and we get the report in, and something that we're going to give to a client, we feel confident in saying, okay, this is what we have, this is what we can do, and this is what the costs are, because it's not just something we're more like what I would shoot out, a little small email. You're sending a 3, 4, 5 page report that details everything, and it's very helpful. So you are very gracious to go and have and explore your resources and let everybody know what's aware. Okay, so nothing else that you want to plug or promote? I don't know. I know last year you were doing some speaking. I don't know if you have any speaking events or anything, papers coming out that you want to make the audience aware of, or is that it?
No, that's it. We're going to be at PDAC in Toronto. We're going to be at Roundup in Vancouver. We'll be at a number of other conventions that we haven't completely decided on this year. I've got a lot more time than I've had in the past to go and speak to people. We've been all over the place in the last couple of years talking. But what I do want to say is this, that remote sensing doesn't have to be mysterious. The reason we write those long proposals and recommendations is because we like people to have a very clear understanding of what it is that they're going to get and what they can get. And we believe it's our responsibility to communicate those things. It's our field. It's our professional ethic. And I want to thank you very much, Ryan, for the time that you've taken to have this meeting with me. I appreciate it very much, and I look forward to our ongoing relationship in 2017.
Absolutely. And just so everybody knows, I will link to the Roundup, which is coming up in probably the third week of January, if I had to guess. That's about when it was last year. I went. It was a great time. You can meet David. He'll be there. And there's a lot of other interesting things that goes on there. And I will link to the PDAC in the show notes as well. David, it was so good. I will talk to you later.
All the best down in Texas.
Thanks to David again for coming on. And I'm going to keep it short since we had a little bit longer of an interview. If you could, final reminder for the book giveaway, go leave a written review in iTunes and you'll be entered to win. Next week, we have on Aaron Drucker talking about the difference between a state-owned company that we talked about so much and the non-state-owned entity. And so look forward to that. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R2 Global.